Jensen, who's done a fair bit of research as an educator into brain research. And he's talking about an animal neuron. Of course, they did a lot of research with animals and still do, and have moved way more into human, which is interesting because of the technology. He looked at stress and the impact on stress for building these pathways, these dendrites. And he found that an animal in a subordinate role, that's how he sort of categorized somebody that was waiting for somebody else to lead them and to support them, had less of these neural pathways, these dendrites, than an animal that was in a dominant role. And he was looking at that by social stress. So who's in charge? Who's at the top of the pack? Who's the one that everybody looks to? Interesting, really interesting. When you think of it as a teacher, I started to consider who were the leaders in my classroom and how was I spreading out that leadership to give people different opportunities. When I think about it in my home, is there one particular child that forever leads? Interesting when you're in a home, and some of you had your hands up with older children, as they start to drop away and go to university, the dynamics around your table shift a little. At least that's what I'm finding. And so someone who was a leader who's now away at university allows the others to kind of move into that place a little bit. So stress is a bit of an interesting thing to consider because it's different for every student, for every child. And for one, the stress of a different teacher is huge. But for another, it doesn't matter. For one, taking on 3 or 4 major activities does them in, and for another, it's what turns them on. And so I guess as parents, we're trying also to be very clear about and seeing and knowing too much stress can really also impact the development of our kids' brains. If we did the math, because I told you it was 200 billion when they're born and 100 billion approximately around age 10 to 12, actually in utero it's about 500 billion neurons. So you start to decline over time and you think, man, by the time they get to age 10 or 12, they're left with about 20% of their brain. Not true, but 20% of the original kind of neurons that they had. And, what are the odds that our students, that our kids kept the same 20%? Not great. And for me, this answers some of that question. Same gene pool, look at these children. Have you had that experience? You're thinking, wow, we have 2 kids and they're so different. Well, their experiences, their teachers, their friends, all of the things that go into the growth and development for them are different, and so they're evolving as different people. Just interesting to keep in mind. And as teachers, we remind our teachers that that's why you have a grade 10, fill in the blank, history, math, whatever class, but they're not all the same. They bring very different brains to that learning. So what are the implications then as parents? I don't know if you do homework with your kids at all and they say, man, why do we have to learn this stuff? And sometimes now as a parent and as a teacher, I would say to the students, you know what? You are actually growing these dendrites, these amazing pathways that will stay with you for the rest of your life. That's the great thing. Whatever we're developing now is going with us. It's like muscles, right? We build muscles so we can use them. Most of us don't build muscles just to look good, unless you're an adolescent boy, but. And so we build these dendrites to take with us. So yeah, you know what, this obscure formula in math or this really teeny detail here, yeah, you may think, yeah, I'm not going to use it, but what you will do is you'll use those pathways again as you learn other things. That's the baby, let your baby listen to music and they'll be really good in math, those sorts of things. That's kind of the same idea. Great to have enriching activities. Use it or lose it. It's that whole gardening thing. Where there isn't activity, it'll prune away. That's not a bad thing, but I think we want to be a little intentional about that. Sleep and stress have a huge impact. I don't know if this cartoon resonates with any of you, but I'll just read it in case you can't at the back. Mom is calling her teenage son, Jeremy, time to get up. No answer. Jeremy, it's 7:15. Rise and shine. You can see it's getting a little more intense. Let's go. Finally, she bashes in the door and yells, get up! He says, I don't mean to be critical, but if you'd get me up earlier, we wouldn't have to race to school like this every day. So I don't know if that resonates with any of you. Interesting, though, that I haven't told you how these pathways develop. And the way that they develop is as we move through our day and we have our learning and our experiences, we put little protein markers in our brain. And then as we sleep, those protein markers get wired in, and we have that learning after sort of 4 or 5 cycles, REM cycles, of the day, and then we move into the next day. We know that we've wired in the learning of the day when we wake up naturally. So I'm reading this and I think, man, I didn't know people woke up naturally. That just gives you a sense of where my wiring is at. Really important, though, that as we work and as we think about even adolescence, and many of you have kids in that camp, melatonin that's secreted as it kind of gets dusk and we get ready for getting sleepy can be up to 2 hours delayed for teenagers, adolescents. And so you've got these kids that find it harder and harder to go to sleep at a decent time. And yet, school still starts at the time it does in the morning, right? And I don't know about you, but getting kids out of bed in the morning can be tricky. So, and our kids need, how many hours of sleep do you think would be, according to research, that a student would need, an adolescent, roughly? 9 and a half. So I saw a recent study that said about 8 or 8.5, which I thought was interesting, but most of the stuff I read is around 9 hours. That's a lot of sleep. If you have a kid who's into sports and doing schoolwork, and that's a lot of sleep. And it's something that is really, really tricky. I know for my own kids, hard to do. We'd sit at the dinner table and I'd tell them they needed 9 hours of sleep. I'm known as the one who thinks sleep is the solution for everything. And I'd say you need 9 hours, and we're not going to negotiate a bedtime, but what time's your practice in the morning, and we'll back map it, right, for that. And then they'd say, please, please stop reading that research. Killing us. But the other piece that's really interesting to know is that the suicide rate and some of the emotional mental health stuff of teenagers is off the charts. And when we're sleep deprived, we see things in a darker way. There's a researcher out of Chicago that would say teenagers are the most sleep deprived segment of our population. So I think it's worthwhile to understand this and to think about how we encourage our kids, you know, get great marks. Oh yeah, you can join that club. Can you get a part-time job, right? And pretty soon there's not enough hours in the day. So we need to, I think, encourage kids to try to keep a bit of balance in that. The second thing that I want to talk about is where our learning happens. So imagine this is a brain. When we start to learn something, we're learning it in the cortex, or the front, or kind of the wrinkly bit at the front. And as we get better, it moves kind of down more into the back of the brain, or the brain stem. So it's interesting that as you learn things, it gets smoother. Learning initially things don't happen with grace and finesse. How many of you have taught your student, well, let me ask you this first. How many of you have driven along, at the end of the day, you pull into the driveway and you think, man, I went through 3 lights and I can't remember if any of them were green. Have anybody had that experience? Because as adults, our driving is happening a lot at the base of our brain. We're not thinking about it. It's not up here. Conversely, how many of you have taught a child to drive or been with a child who's learning to drive? Yeah, me too. 2 of them. And that's a really interesting experience because you can see these kids as they're hanging onto the wheel and checking their mirrors and looking around, and like the cortex is practically smoking with the work that's going on, right? My eldest is a little spatially challenged, and so we're doing all this thing, and she's so conscientious and checking everything, and am I doing okay, Mom? I'm like, yeah, but can you feel the bumpy feeling? And she said, yeah. I said, it's because we're on the shoulder. Can you go back onto the road? So there's that whole idea of learning. The difference between us and our kids is sometimes the difference between our kids as they learn new things. In school, we talk about something called automaticity, the ability to kind of make our way through a skill without really having to think about it. And that can happen in lots of places. We refer often to that with reading. And we know that when kids get to a certain level, we're not even concerned with the reading. It's read this and. And we're most interested with what comes after the and. That's because we think that automaticity is kicked in terms of their reading skills. So what does that mean? Learning is something new, and it takes time, and it's hard work. I believe, if we're thinking about brain research, if we're thinking about parenting, that we have to model and talk with our kids about perseverance. We're going to get to that in a bit when we talk about the growth mindset. Really important principle. If the work's too easy or too hard, our brain thinks about other stuff. Our mind wanders. And that's the challenge for us as parents and as teachers, is to try to find that key spot. Learning is making connections between neurons that we're going to use for the rest of our lives, and we've touched a little bit on that as well. I just want to share a couple pictures with you that I found to be really, really powerful. This is a picture of a brain, and the lit up part is the activity that's going on in that brain. And so on this side is the front of the brain, and on my right is the back. And this is a student who's reading. This is a student who's speaking, so they're using sort of the temporal lobe above their ear to speak and to listen. That's where the language is processed. And this is a student who's using words to explain something they've learned to somebody else. And I have to tell you that my interest in brain research came out of this set of slides that I saw about 7 or 8 years ago. And I thought, man, how do I value talk in my house? How do I value talk in my classroom? How do I get kids telling each other? How do I sit around the table at night and say, what'd you learn today? Tell me about that. Because when they're repeating it back to me, all of the brain is active and engaged. And those pathways, they're getting deeper. So I think that's a really powerful thing to kind of think about as parents and the implications in our home. So I know it's another kind of interest. But see, you've sat now for about 20 minutes or so, and the research says 15 to 20 minutes is about the max, and then you're kind of full and you need to dump some of it out of your short-term memory so you'll have it there when you need it later. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to ask you just to get a partner, and just one thing that stood out to you so far in terms of what we've talked about. We've talked about growing those pathways, and we've talked about learning starting up here and moving down, lit up brains, there's all kinds, and you got notes, so really you can cheat. It's good. Okay, you got about 2 minutes. You need to just each take about a minute and talk about what stood out for you to a partner, or threes, whatever's easy. This is the third piece that I just want to talk to you. I don't know, I know that, there are many teachers that I've worked with, and myself included, who at times, if you could articulate, would say, I have so much wisdom and knowledge to impart if only they would pay attention. I don't know if you feel that as parents also. I do as a parent too. But I think understanding how and what causes our brain to pay attention is kind of an interesting thing also to think about. So there's a part at the back of the brain called the RAS, the reticular activating system, and it's sort of triggered, and it sorts all of the stimuli that come into us throughout the day. And there are unconscious things and conscious things that go on that help us to understand about attention. Unconscious, we probably have less control over, but it's good to know about. Conscious is probably a place we can think a little more deeply about. So physical, if we're tired or we're hungry, it's really hard to pay attention. And you know that. And often I've said to my own kids, you know what, it's late, go to bed. Like, you don't need to stay up and study for another hour. You're barely internalizing anything. And that sleep, in fact, remember we talked about sleep wiring in the learning, and they've done studies and tests where they could see that a student who studies and sleeps versus pulls an all-nighter, you can guess which one does better at the sleeper. So, if kids are physical, tired, hungry, it's really hard for them to focus and pay attention. That may also be instrumental as parents in terms of when we have those difficult conversations. It may not be right before dinner with our large teenage son who's starving. That just may not be the best route to go. If something's novel and new, we tend to focus on it and pay attention. Again, as a parent, I don't know the stretch there is in terms of what you want to do. It might be a new place that you go, a place to have a conversation, or something that might catch their attention. Movement and intensity is an interesting thing. What that really speaks to is when something's loud or bright or it catches our attention. I don't know if you've noticed, but you watch TV shows and the volume kind of goes along like this, and then the commercials come on and the volume goes like that. And that's because advertisers know that intensity of sound catches our attention, and so they'll turn it up. So, as parents, we can use that intensity of sound as well. But we may want to be strategic around that, right? So what are the conscious things that actually help to catch attention? Choice is huge. It's huge in the classroom and it's huge in our homes. If we can say, okay, put things out to our kids as choices as much as possible. Not always. You can't always have a choice. And sometimes you can make something look like a choice. You can take the garbage out tonight or at 6 tomorrow morning. It's really up to you. It's still a choice, right? But the idea is you're taking the garbage out. So giving kids choice catches their attention and helps them feel more engaged in the process. If we can find meaning, if we're talking to our kids and trying to get them to understand something, we need to link to meaning. One of the pieces of research I was reading talked about, so often as parents we say, you're going to grow up and you're not going to be able to get a job. I don't know if we say this as parents, but some people might. You're not going to get a job, and it's all going to go sideways 25 years from now. That doesn't have a lot of meaning for our kids, and therefore they're not really paying attention. But in the end, if we were to be saying to them, you know what? On Friday you want to go out, so if you want to go out, we need to have a conversation today about how that's going to happen. That's far more meaningful, and as a kid, I'm way more engaged with you now. So it's just that idea of linking to meaning. And emotion is the third piece that really connects.